Stories shape how we see the world. Voice of Witness is an award-winning oral history nonprofit harnessing the transformative power of storytelling. We work with individuals and communities impacted by injustice, helping them document their lived experiences through oral history, telling their own stories in their own words. In an era of reductive sound bites, we need this kind of nuanced grassroots storytelling to create a more just future. Visit voiceofwitness.org/learn to get involved, check out our workshops, and download tools to support your own project. Join us in building a more connected world, one story at a time.
Hi, I'm Reshma Saujani, founder of Girls Who Code. Look, I'd consider myself a pretty successful adult woman. I've written books, founded 2 successful nonprofits, and I'm raising 2 incredible kids. But here's the thing. I still wake up wondering, is this it? And if the best years are yet to come, when's that going to start? Join me on My So-Called Midlife, my new podcast with Lemonada Media, where we're building a playbook for navigating midlife, one episode at a time. Each week, I'll chat with extraordinary guests who've transformed their midlife crisis into opportunities for growth and newfound purpose. At some point, we all ask ourselves, is there more to life? I'm here to discover how to thrive in my second act, right alongside you. My So-Called Midlife is out now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Lemonada. Hello and welcome to Good Things. I am your host, Gloria Riviera. This is the first episode in our 3-part series on the foster care system in the United States. I will remind you of our guiding mantra here at Lemonada, which is to make life suck less. Listen, people, foster care and foster care adoption, which I learned in this episode, simply means children who are adopted out of foster care and not, for example, as infants. It is a problematic system in our country. It could suck way less. We will be talking to leaders in this space who are working to better the system, change makers who believe in these kids. You are going to meet Rita Soranen. She is the president and CEO of the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption. Several things struck me about this national nonprofit public charity. First of all, its namesake, Dave Thomas, was adopted. He founded Wendy's, which you may know. Rita will talk more about his amazing life story. The foundation is dedicated to finding what Dave Thomas was looking for: forever families, permanent homes for children waiting to be adopted out of foster care in the U.S. and Canada. The foundation has a program. It is called Wendy's Wonderful Kids, and it's evolved to raise money with various states to hire adoption professionals, known as recruiters. These people, they are angels on earth. They do a deep dive with each kid, age about 9-ish and up. They learn who they are, what they have experienced, and what they need in a home and a family. The goal is to find a match, to find these kids a forever home. Rita believes every kid deserves the right to a family and a home at any age. Rita, welcome to Good Things.
Thank you.
So I like to start with a very simple question, which is, where did you grow up and what did your family look like? What was your experience like?
I love that. Well, I was born in Michigan, which is always a bone of contention for folks here in Ohio. But moved to Ohio when I was about 10. It was a pretty standard, I was the youngest of 4 kids. We moved into an area that my parents could not afford, but they moved there because the schools were very good. And so it was always a situation of kind of living on the edge. Certainly we were at no risk, but always living on the edge. But they did that so that we could go to good schools. On my father's side, my grandmother was Mexican and my grandfather was Finnish. So have an interesting mix of ethnicities and cultures in my life as well. And my grandmother in particular spent a lot of time with us at times helping to raise kids. So it was just an interesting sort of middle America family that I grew up in.
Well, I can relate to that because my grandfather is from Mexico and he lived with my mom and my father, and then when they divorced, with my father. So we grew up with that presence in our life.
Yep, exactly.
And he was very famous for announcing bad news when we came home from school. Bad news, bad news. And then I went into news. So there you go.
My grandmother loved her strong coffee and a piece of pie. That's how she got over any situation.
Yeah, that's great. And where did you go? Where was your education?
So I started out at The Ohio State University because I was right there in Columbus, Ohio, and then got married relatively young, kind of was in that escape home mode. And my then husband, my first husband, went off to college, graduate school in North Carolina, so joined him there and spent some time in North Carolina. But I also dropped out of college at that point, my graduating quarter at The Ohio State University, which was silly, but I did. And then when we moved to Kentucky from there after he graduated and finished up college at the University of Louisville. And then came back to Columbus when my oldest daughter was born and realized that maybe the escape from family wasn't the best idea and came back where family was when she was an infant.
There's so much to talk about there. One of my more irreverent friends says we should all be married to our second husbands.
I will second that.
And you mentioned having a child at a relatively young age, but that's been something that you've pointed to as being a pivotal moment in the career you eventually dedicated your life to. So talk to me about that, about having a young baby and how it shifted your perspective. I mean, I'm curious in how it shifted your perspective as a woman, but also career-wise.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I've thought a lot about it. And her name is Jordan. And when Jordan was just about 9 months old, we moved from Kentucky back to Columbus, Ohio. I was still between figuring out, this was a long time ago. How do I get into the workforce? How do I do that with an infant? Not a lot of my peers were doing that yet, but I clearly wanted to. And so I was in that in-between stage. I was home with her full time. And there was an incident not in our neighborhood, but in the city of an infant that had been so horribly abused that she passed away. And I was in that time of my life where I had an infant at home that I was caring for, and there was this horrible case of abuse, and I was just primed to say, there's something wrong here. How could this possibly happen? I was also one of those kids, and maybe it's by virtue of being the youngest in the family, who came out kicking and screaming, that's not fair. Life's not fair. It's not fair what we do to kids, right? And people would pat me on the head and say, oh, you'll understand when you're older. I still kind of think like the 8-year-old that I was then. But so this instant of abuse, I said, I've got to do something. And I began volunteering with what was then the Ohio chapter of the National Committee to Prevent Child Abuse, and learned a lot about the dynamics of abuse and neglect. That, it's not, parents don't intend usually to harm their children. What are the dynamics that go behind that? And why are infants and teenagers and toddlers so at risk of abuse? And it's because of their behaviors, right? The behaviors that kind of put us on edge, whether it's crying or defying or whatever it is. So that turned into a paid position, from a volunteer position to a paid position. And I realized this is where I wanted to be, because quite honestly, in that interim, what I was doing was working on a master's degree back at The Ohio State University in landscape architecture, something entirely different. So again, as apparently was my routine, I dropped out of that, but started this position at what was called the League Against Child Abuse. And that turned into then a series of learnings and positions and mentor positions from others to me, that I realized this was the path that I wanted to be on. And it moved from there into another position. I had the opportunity then to apply for and move to the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption, which for me at the time and still, I guess, feels full circle from prevention. How do we keep kids and families from getting into the child welfare system to intervention? How do we advocate, particularly for those children who don't necessarily have voices? How do we advocate for their best interests? But I've been so lucky and so blessed to have been on this journey.
I know that you joined the Dave Thomas Foundation in 2001. Is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I just want to go back for a moment because at the beginning of this, you talk about being this 8-year-old child kicking and screaming, saying, this is not right. We shouldn't be doing this. Something that we say a lot at Lemonada is it doesn't have to be like this, right? We have so many systems in our country where we just come up against brick wall after brick wall and think it doesn't have to be like this. But as a young child, can you share with us any recollections that you found particularly to be unjust, unfair?
Yeah, and look, I grew up in the late 60s, early 70s. It was a volatile time, not so dissimilar to the past few years and the years forward that we're experiencing, where the civil rights movement and Vietnam, and as an early teenager, especially during Vietnam. And so all of those things where we didn't have social media, but boy, we had Life magazine, right? And we had news stations, the 3 news stations that would flash images of things that were made such a deep impression on me as a child. And within our family, we had issues of depression and substance abuse. And so it was those conflicting issues of trying to figure out, where do I fit in this world to make change? Or can I even do it when people are saying, never mind, other people will take care of that. So I think it was that very impressional part of my life of external and internal circumstances that just kept converging, saying, something must be done here.
Yeah, I love that idea of, because I think it persists today, and especially for our listeners, what can I do? Can I do anything? And we will get to that because I know that it's been so critical to your work. Well, talk to me about joining the Dave Thomas Foundation. I'm always fascinated in the challenges that you saw in the role and what your perspective was on how ready you were for that role. You list all of these things that you've done, and I love the idea of you being in each role, finding mentors, absorbing, and being, at one point, a single mother to 2 children. When you got to the Dave Thomas Foundation, did you feel ready?
So I think I was when I entered the door, I thought I was. When I got in the door, I realized I still had a lot to learn.
We're going to take a quick break, but we will be right back with more on Good Things.
Interested in the power of first-person storytelling? The Voice of Witness book series documents the oral histories of people directly impacted by and fighting against injustice. Each collection supports historically excluded communities to tell their own stories in their own words. The books feature a diversity of voices, including those of refugees and immigrants, incarcerated people, communities displaced from public housing, farm workers, indigenous peoples, and more. These powerful stories highlight crucial issues and expose the impacts of harmful narratives and policies, laying the groundwork to build solidarity and movements for change. Voice of Witness books are read and used by thousands of educators, organizations, and advocates across the country each year. Visit voiceofwitness.org/read to learn more, access free resources, and get involved. Want more from your favorite Lemonada Media podcasts while supporting the shows that help make life suck less? Subscribe to Lemonada Premium today. As a subscriber, you'll unlock exclusive bonus content like never-before-heard interviews, behind-the-scenes moments, bonus episodes, and so much more. It's easy to sign up no matter what podcast app you use. On Apple, you can just click the Lemonada logo in the Apple Podcast app and hit subscribe. For all other podcast apps, head to lemonada.supportingcast.fm to subscribe. That's lemonada.supportingcast.fm.
I've read that Dave Thomas started the foundation in 1992. And yes, Wendy's. I grew up with Wendy's. We've listened to your podcast. We know that supporting Wendy's is in some part supporting the Dave Thomas Foundation. But talk to me about, zoom out, if you will, for a moment, about your understanding of the why behind Dave Thomas starting this foundation. And in particular, the focused group within the system he wanted to help.
Yeah. Well, he was adopted, and that became the impetus because people might think logically for a corporation to go into cause-related activities, they'll go with something that reflects their brand. And so you might think, well, Wendy's is a food company, so perhaps they should have connected with food insecurity, right? Adoption seems very arm's length. But because he was adopted, and he was adopted as an infant, but he very much, his life path very much mirrored our older youth in America's foster care system. His adoptive mother passed away when he was 5. His father was an itinerant worker, and so they moved from place to place. And he was frequently raised by his grandmother, Minnie. So he spent more time with her as a parent than his adoptive dad, and he had lost his adoptive mom. And so he really drew on all of those experiences. And you know, people can certainly read his story. It's phenomenal. But when he and his father finally moved to Indiana, he was working at a restaurant called the Hobby House, and his dad was going to move again. And at age 15, he said, nope, I'm going to stay here. And so he left home. He was out on his own at 15, dropped out of high school. But the food business became his passion and his livelihood. And so it was that passion that as he was getting toward the end of his career as CEO, that he knew with deeply embedded what he had hoped to create with the Wendy's company was this DNA of giving back in the communities in which they were successful. And how could they do that at a different level? And so it really became at first a function of the marketing department of the Wendy's company to create this Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption. And how do we capitalize on Dave Thomas's passion for adoption? Even though he had all of those challenges in his life as a family, he still understood and thrived on the value of family, had created one of his own as an adult with 5 children and a wife that, he was married to for 40 plus years. And to build on his celebrity at the time, he was in all kinds of commercials. Everybody knew Dave Thomas commercials. When he started the restaurant in 1969, they didn't. But as that grew, and in the 80s, when he really became, and maybe 90s, an icon, was able to say, let's use that celebrity, let's leverage this Wendy's brand and celebrity to advance the cause of raising awareness about children in foster care in the United States waiting to be adopted. And so it was that convergence of thinking, I think, at the Wendy's company to say, what do we do best? We sell square hamburgers. We sell Frosties. We know how to brand something. We know how to raise awareness about something. Let's put that into a foundation and make sure that children in foster care waiting to be adopted can get adopted.
What is the situation like right now? Paint for us a picture of how many kids are in the foster care system. And I've read this phrase, foster care adoption. Yeah. So I'll ask for your help in getting me up to speed. Is that the way to refer to it? Is that the vernacular that you use? Foster care adoption, those 3 words together?
Yeah.
Okay. So how many kids are in the system and how many kids are at risk of aging out without a permanent home?
Yeah. And I'll back up just for a second. And the reason we use the phrase foster care adoption is to differentiate from the other kinds of adoption. So when people are thinking about adopting, typically, we want to expand or create a family. They're thinking infant adoption. And that infant adoption could either be domestic infant or international infant, right? Or there's step-parent adoption. And so we differentiate. There is also this group of children in the foster care system who are waiting to be adopted. And so that's why we don't just say adoption, but foster care adoption. So right now in America, as we're sitting here, there are nearly 400,000 children in foster care, in some sort of substitute care, whether it's kinship care or a stranger foster care, and they're there because they've been abused or neglected or abandoned. And the courts have said, you can't be safe in your biological home. So we're going to take you out of that home and put you in a different place until we can figure out how to make sure you can live safely in your home. Children deserve to grow up in the family of origin that they have, in the community that they have, within the culture that they identify. That's where children should be. And that's why that first part of my career, that child abuse prevention, is so critical. How do we keep children out of the foster care system? Because it is a system, and it's not where children can thrive in a system. But for right now, about 108,000 children who have gone through hearings and activities and stood in front of a judge and had people work on behalf of the family. At some point, the judge has said, this family cannot be made safe enough for you, and we're going to permanently sever this child from this family. And the phrase is actually, and it's a horrible phrase, we're going to terminate parental rights. And so now that child is without a family. And that's the 108,000 children in America right now who are legal orphans in this country and are waiting for someone to claim them as their child.
Can I just ask you how you feel about that phrase, terminate parental rights?
Yeah, it's a horrible phrase. It's a horrible activity, right? When you think about it, I think about my own two children, and that a judge would say, you no longer have legal access to this child. You can't determine their healthcare needs. You can't determine their religion. You can't determine where they go to school. You have no more right of access to this child. Now, they've lost it for a reason. Unfortunately, right now in this country, that reason too often is the intensity of substance abuse, right? And so if we had good programs that parents could go to and help solve that crisis in their lives, but so many of our children are seeing their parents die of an overdose of fentanyl. It's incredible right now. But others, yes, physical abuse, sexual abuse, the kinds of things. There are a lot of children who move into the foster care system, though, because of poverty. And so it comes under that umbrella of neglect. I can't provide adequate housing. I can't provide adequate food. I can't provide education for my child. Again, is that something where we could step in and help? Absolutely. And should we? Absolutely. Do we do it well enough? Not yet. And so many children come in under an umbrella of neglect, when if we did a better job up front of helping family find the resources that they need, providing the kind of assistance that they need, then we wouldn't have that movement of those children into the foster care system either.
And Rita, as I listen to you, I'm nodding because all of this resonates with what I know to be your passion of preventative care. And so often when we talk about the challenges our country faces, I've spoken to people who say, we have a structure, right? And it's not all bad. So rather than starting something from the ground up, let's get in there and fix it. But I am interested in two things. I'm interested in your passion for preventative care and what you think we need to do differently. I'm also interested in hearing more about some data I've seen that say that 51% of Americans believe children are in foster care because they have done something wrong, because they are bad kids, because they are juvenile delinquents. Another phrase that I have a problem with. Let's start with the latter.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me about the public perception of children that are older in the foster care system and why people think they're bad kids?
Exactly. And thank you for that, because this is one of those statistics that keeps me up at night. Every few years, we do a Harris poll, and we get a pulse of Americans' attitudes toward the system, toward children in the system, and toward this notion of adoption, foster care adoption. And that's where that figure came from in 2022, I believe, 2021. 51%. So it's a majority. It's a slim majority, but it's a huge majority when you think about that number, believe that children are in care because they've done something wrong, when nothing could be further from the truth. And so that's part of the work of the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption, is to dispel these myths and misperceptions. But I think they think that because, look, if you go to an event tonight and there's lots of parents there and a number of them have teenagers, right? And you begin to talk about your teenager, what's the first thing that happens? Eyes start rolling and faces start screwing up. It's like, oh, right, teenagers. We don't like teenagers in this country because they're doing what they're supposed to do. They're being defiant. They're learning. Their brains are still developing. They're exercising independence. All of those things as a parent, we think, oh, I'm losing control of this child, so I've got to buckle down, right? And you're right. That's another podcast, parenting a teenager. But that's, I think, that combined with, we also have deeply held, there's an issue of racial injustice here too, and racial inequity in the child welfare system. And frequently, what we'll see are issues with Black teenagers, right? And so we commingle that sort of distrust of teenagers to begin with the racial injustice issues that still permeate this country and the child welfare system, quite honestly. And somehow then we say, well, if they were 16 and they're in foster care, it must be because they've done something wrong. They've whatever in the imagination comes up, they've done something wrong, as opposed to something has been done to them. And if they have behaviors that are challenging, it's because of the trauma, the grief, and the loss that they've experienced in their life, not because they're bad kids. And so we've got a lot of work to do at the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption to continue to change that narrative about who these children are in the foster care system and why they're there.
Okay, sit tight, everyone. We're going to take one more quick break, and we'll be right back with more good things.
Hi, I'm Emily Deschanel.
And I'm Carla Gallo, and we're excited to tell you about Boneheads, our new Bones rewatch podcast.
I played Dr. Temperance Brennan.
And I played Daisy Wick, and we are going to watch from the very beginning.
We're going to watch the episodes. We're going to reminisce. We're going to laugh. We're going to cry. We're going to tell behind-the-scenes stories.
We're going to go on tangents.
A lot of tangents.
So whether you're a seasoned Bones fanatic or a newcomer looking to dip your toes in to the wild world of forensic anthropology, this show is for you.
Boneheads from Lemonada Media is out now wherever you get your podcasts. Want a sneak preview of hot new audiobooks? Then check out Your Next Listen, a new podcast from Lemonada Media and Simon & Schuster Audio. We've got everything: the hottest new thrillers, best-selling celebrity memoirs, and swoony romances. And these aren't tiny clips either. They're entire chapters you can listen to. Your Next Listen is out November 11th, wherever you get your podcasts.
In your work, and you've been with the Dave Thomas Foundation since 2001, and also because I am a glass half full sort of gal, when you look at the stories that you've seen develop over time, I would imagine you've seen, the word that comes to mind immediately is, I don't know if this is correct, I would imagine you've seen a lot of positive blossoming that happens with these children. I mean, you're nodding, yes. Can you share with us some of those stories? Because I don't like to do shows that are all about the challenges. There are silver linings here. There are wonderful stories. Do any come to mind that you feel comfortable sharing with us?
Absolutely. There are so many stories. There are so many stories. And I would, direct people to our website and our YouTube channel, because we video as many of these as we can to show that this isn't a hopeless situation, that children can thrive in families, that the stereotypes can be dispelled and the misperception dispelled. But I think of a couple in particular. There was one young lady that we focused on who had grown up in a horrendous situation. And in fact, she had been in foster care and was essentially re-abused in foster care. She had chronic ear infections that were not taken care of, and as a result became partially deaf or fully deaf in one ear and partially deaf in another. And all she wanted to do was become an artist and express herself through art. And finally, through one of the programs that we support here at the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption, this incredible worker found the perfect family for this young lady. She was adopted at age 15, when most kids are on the track for leaving foster care without a family. And not only was thriving in this family, but was creating beautiful art once she was able to feel safe where she was, and really express the artist that she wanted to be, and was on the track for going to college when she had given up all hope for going to college. There's another one that I think about of this one young man who had been in foster care for he was probably around 12, had been in foster care for 7 years. And no one knew it. Kids don't talk about it. They don't want to talk about the fact that they're in foster care. And so his best friend from school was going back and forth with his best friend, and loved his family, his best friend's family. But this family didn't realize what his circumstances were, quite honestly, which seemed a little bit odd, but didn't know his circumstances. And again, from a program of the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption, we call them adoption recruiters. This recruiter, their job is to get to know these kids and find out who's in their lives and do deep dives into their case files. And this young man at age 12 was pretty shy, but the more she got to know him, he talked a lot about this best friend and his best friend's family. So this recruiter just went right to the best friend's family and said, look, is this somebody who you might think about bringing into your home? And they were absolutely amazed, one, that he was available for adoption, and immediately said yes. And so, long story short, he was ultimately moved toward being adopted into this family. And when they got to the court hearing, so this was about 2 years later, so at this point he was about maybe 13-ish. And the judge does what they're supposed to do. They talk to everybody at that hearing, but they talk to the youth if they're old enough and say, what do you think about this? Do you want to be adopted by this family? And again, he was so shy, and it took a couple of proddings from the judge to say, I really would like some kind of answer from you, because this is important to me to know if this is the right place for you. And finally, the young man looked up at the judge and said, yes, because now my best friend will also be my brother. It's those kinds of stories that we see.
In that story that you just told, there are two things that I want to touch on. One is this program of recruiters through the Dave Thomas Foundation. And can you just start with how that program started and how you felt it was going, and then scaling it? What does that look like? What has that looked like?
Sure. And it goes back to one of your questions about, when you walked to the door, were you ready? One of the things that I did, because it is once I decided, yes, this is where I'm going to stay and I'm going to make a go of this, I really did a deep dive into what we were doing. And we were very much an awareness organization, but Dave Thomas passed away about 6 months after I started the position. And so we were grappling with that, as well as here's the sort of public face of the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption. What do we do in his absence? And so trying to decide, is awareness exactly where we need to be? Of course, we still need to raise awareness. But there's this issue of year over year over year, and it hasn't changed that much. 20,000 of the children, so when we rattled off 108,000 children are waiting to be adopted, every year about 20,000 of those children turn 18 and leave foster care without a family. They've been freed for adoption. But we didn't live up to our promise of a family for them. And we know that as a result, any child at that age, and 20, 19, 18 is still a child, right? Without the safety net of family, they're much more at risk of negative outcomes, of homelessness, of unemployment, of being undereducated, of substance abuse, all of those negative, not because they're bad kids, because they don't have the rudder and safety net of a family. And so we began to look at that, and we did a scan of organizations that we were funding and others. What's keeping you from getting these kids adopted? It's your sort of moral and actually legal obligation to get these children adopted. Why aren't these children getting adopted? And what we heard to an agency is we don't have the time or the resources to focus on these children. We're back at the other end triaging kids coming in the door. And these kids are, they're placed, they're steady in a foster family, and we'll give them some training and teach them how to age out of care. That's where the light bulb went off for us. Here's a gap the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption needs to fill. We'll continue to raise awareness, but we've got to figure out a program that works on behalf of those children most at risk of aging out of foster care, and that's teenagers, children in sibling groups, children with special needs, and children who have been in care for so long that they oppose every effort at permanency on their behalf. And so that's where we began to pull together what are the existing best practices. Help us understand how you work with this population of children. And there were some emerging best practices, but nothing at an evidence-based level. And so we pulled together what we called a child-focused recruitment program based on bits and pieces of these emerging best practices. It's really just good social work. And we said, we will give grants to organizations that use this model we've created that says, carry a smaller caseload of children, do a deep dive into the case file, find out who's already in their lives that people have forgotten about or ignored, and work with this child, meet with them regularly, get to know them, gain their trust, and work as hard as you can to get these children adopted. Stick with them until they're adopted. So we tested it in 7 pilot sites across the nation in 2004. And what we said is, we'll give you grant dollars to hire a full-time adoption professional, a skilled professional, somebody who already understands these dynamics, and carry a caseload and implement this model. And let's see if it works. Let's just see if it works. And if it doesn't, okay, at least we tried. But if it does, then let's figure out a way to grow it. By 2007, we had grown this program large enough by going to our Wendy's friends and saying, can you help us fundraise? Because we need dollars to do this, to grow this program. And so we called it Wendy's Wonderful Kids to recognize the incredible work that they did fundraising for us. And by 2007, we had enough presence in all 50 states across the nation that we could do a rigorous evaluation to say, is this really working? We saw the numbers working. And at the end of 5 years, what it told us is it's not only working, it's working up to 3 times better. And counterintuitively, more than 3 times better, the older a child is, the more likely it is that it will be adopted. And so we said, all right, it's not unlike you test a medicine and it works. We've got to get it out there. And so that's when we began this journey of saying, it's great that privately, as a nonprofit organization, we can fund, for example, 6 recruiters across the state of Ohio, but they need 80 to 100 to service that population.
In Ohio alone?
In Ohio alone, yeah.
So you can fund 6 to 7, and you think the need is for 80.
Right. And that's what we did, though. So as soon as that research came out, we went to the state of Ohio and we said, look, we've been funding significantly in the state. We've got this research. We've tested this program, and this was 2012, for 8 years. We think we've got something here. Is there any possible way that we can come up with a different strategy for putting these recruiters in place? And that means a public-private partnership and a co-investment relationship. Because we can raise billions of dollars, but we're not the child welfare system. We shouldn't just be the ones. These children are in the custody of the state. They're in the custody of the counties in the state. There's got to be a way for the states and the counties to do a better job, but philanthropy can be at the table. And Ohio came back immediately and said yes. And we currently have 83 full-time adoption professionals working across the state of Ohio. They've finalized more than 1,600 permanent placements for children in Ohio alone. So that put us on the path for scaling nationally. We've had other funders come to the table to help us do this. And we're now scaled or scaling, just like Ohio, in 19 states across the United States. We've finalized more than 14,000 permanent placements. And the good news is it's doing it for the population exactly that we intended to serve. The average age of a child being served through this we call it, again, the Wendy's Wonderful Kids program, is about 14. 14. Wow. We know from research, the day a child turns 9, their likelihood of being adopted decreases significantly, because we also know from that Harris research that we do that 60% of Americans would prefer to adopt a child age 5 or younger. So we've got all these disconnects, but we're working on it. We're working to fix that by saying these children can move to permanency. They do have every right that every other child has to a thriving adulthood, and we can make this happen.
Hearing you tell that story right now, I come out of it and I think, who are these recruiters? But I also think, who are the people doing the adopting? Can you just talk a little bit about the people that you meet who are open to this, who end up adopting these children 9 or older? I mean, to me, it's like angels on earth, right? But I know it's not an easy path, but there is something very acutely recognizable when you have a conversation with someone who tells you, yeah, I was open to this, and here's why.
And sometimes it's just about touching that little piece of them that didn't realize these children were there waiting, right? If they had known, they might have put that into their sort of life plan sooner. But typically, and not always, they tend to be a little bit older, they've already raised children. right? And so they understand what it's like to raise an infant, to raise a toddler. They don't want to do that again. But they also understand the joy of family. And I'd like to have family in my life again. And so, or, I have 2 kids. I don't want to have a third biologically, but I'd like to have more children. So it tends to be people that already have some familiarity with raising a family, but not necessarily. We have a lot of single parents who delayed marriage or decided not to marry, or have delayed children, or have decided not to have children. And so single parents are adopting. Certainly same-sex couples are adopting, significant numbers, who say, I need to do something. I can jump into the foster care system and adopt. So the dynamic of who's adopting has changed significantly in the time even that I've been at the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption. And you don't have to be 30 to adopt. You can be 50. You can be 60. As long as you can care for a child in your home, you don't have to be wealthy. You don't have to have your own home. I think those are all the kinds of misperception. And one of the things that we know is people self-select out because they think it's too expensive. Well, it's expensive to adopt an infant domestically. It's expensive to adopt an infant internationally, and not to devalue children in foster care at all. But those costs are covered typically by the county or the state. And so other than some small costs, and certainly the cost to raise a child, it's not expensive to adopt from foster care. So once we get those stories out and again, continue to change the narrative of who these children are, they're not too old. They're not too damaged. They're not too dangerous. They're just kids that need a family.
Yeah. And something that comes to mind is what we can do, right? We want to help our listeners know what they can do. And yes, dollars are valuable. Not everyone has the capacity to make a significant contribution. I will share with you, I'm one of 6 through several marriages, and my older brother was adopted as an infant in 1964. Incredible person. I was just talking about him last night. He's no longer with us, but I have that experience. He's close to my heart. And here I am. I'm a mother of 3. I'm working, and I don't have a close connection to the foster care adoption world. I have the personal experience of having a brother who was adopted. What can I do?
Absolutely. And there are so many ways to jump in. Just knowing about this conversation and sharing it in your circles, whether it's your faith-based community or whatever groups you are involved in, talk about this in your communities just so you know more about it and can find more out about it. But then that next level of volunteering. Look, again, from my CASA days, it's CASA volunteers, volunteer guardians ad litem who advocate for children in court proceedings. And the training is provided, and judges listen to the CASA volunteers because they have an independent vested interest in a child's well-being. And so they make recommendations to a judge. It's an intensive volunteer position, but it's such a valuable one to be a community member in an arena where typically community members aren't involved unless they have a personal legal involvement, to understand what happens in courtrooms, to understand what happens to these children at that level.
Wait, that's a volunteer position? I mean, this is new. This is, Rita, I'm very embarrassed to say, listeners, this is news to me, like that this opportunity is out there. I mean, my youngest is 8. I'm just getting my feet back on the ground, but that sounds like an incredible opportunity for somebody who cares about children who are in the system.
Such an incredible opportunity.
What would I do? How would that work?
Yep. There's a national network of CASA programs all across the nation. And so just, and we can certainly, reach out to the National CASA Association that has a list of all of those organizations, and then reach out to that organization. They'll tell you when their training times are, what the requirements are. You have to have a background check. You have to be safe. You have to be at least 21. But
check. I'm good.
But beyond that, you have to go through their training so you understand, but you're mentored and supported by the staff of the CASA organization. So you're not out there on your own. But I can't tell you how many times judges say, look, I have social workers in front of me. I have paid attorneys in front of me. I've got all kinds of people in front of me. I really listen to the CASA volunteer because they're here. for one reason, not to get a paycheck, not to prove a point to anybody in the agency, but simply to advocate for this child. So yeah, absolutely. But it's an intensive position, and you only take 1 or 2 cases at a time because it is such an intensive position.
No, but this is so, I feel the energy in my body just hearing about this.
It's great. It's phenomenal. And I still, support CASA programs. I sat on the National CASA board and an advisory board member as well. So it's a really valuable, I think, unsung heroes in communities in particular. Folks can also, though, reach out and just mentor. Lots of adoption organizations have mentor positions, not unlike Big Brothers, Big Sisters, or something like that. You can even, something as simple, there's organizations that provide backpacks for kids going into foster care. There's too many horrendous stories of a child has to move quickly from one place to another and all of their belongings are put into a trash bag. We still have those trash bag stories, which is, again, so sad. But there are organizations out there that provide backpacks for kids and fill them up, and you can help, do that at an organizational level. So many ways to, I think, step in and volunteer, but just understanding who these children are, talking about it with groups of people, and deciding, we can help with Christmas presents at Christmas time, or we can help with school backpacks at school time for these kids in foster care, just to make sure they don't feel like they're forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is something that I take my kids to do with me, go buy presents, take them to our church, wrap them, talk about it. But interestingly, I don't talk about it in the context of my own brother. I talk about it in the context of doing something good for the church. And I feel like the conversation needs to be more personal if you've had any experience with it, with your own children within your own family. Speaking of family, what are the prerequisites that you think people should have before they even consider fostering or adoption? I would not have said before I did these shows on foster care adoption that I would be someone who might be a candidate, but now I feel like I might be a candidate. So what do I need to know?
I think really look at what is your current family circumstance, and it's okay to say it's not right at this time. I want to do this, but it's not the right time. There's too much going on. Talking with your own children, what do you think about the idea of somebody coming in for a short stay? Because there are those issues of, it's very hard when you get to know on a temporary basis a foster child whose goal is to go home. And it may not be the kind of home that you think that child should be in, but it's their home. And so how do you make sure that if you're going to be a foster parent, that you can effectively make sure that this child can go home to their biological family, and that you'll grapple with the sense of loss, because they may be there a year, and in a year's time you come to love a child, and understand that for this child, they may not be able to express it, but you might be one of the best things that happened in their childhood. And at some point they'll know that. And at some point you'll continue to recognize you are good for them. So really assess your own family circumstance. Can you absorb this kind of dynamic? It's hard dealing with the child welfare system. It just is, even with the best of social workers. Sometimes you don't get return phone calls, or you have a need that you think they should be providing and they're not. And so you take it out of your own pocket to do that. So assessing all of that, and can you handle that? Moving into particularly an adoptive situation, how will this change the dynamic of the order of children that I have in my family at this point? How will they respond to somebody new coming into the family? How will I handle all of the new things that I have to do, from court hearings to perhaps aftercare kinds of things? Again, these are children who have experienced intensive layers of trauma, grief, and loss. And so love is absolutely what every child needs, but it doesn't necessarily fix everything right away. And so do I have the fortitude to begin to think about after permanency support systems, from counseling to networking with other adoptive families, to making sure that every resource that might be needed by my child, I can go after and I can advocate for, because, gosh, I thought it was all done the day I adopted, and it might just extend. But what you would do for any child, of course, in your family, but you might think about it differently from an adoptive point of view. And so just understanding, I think, all of those dynamics, and then saying, okay, deep breath, are we ready?
Deep breath, are we ready? Okay. I want to thank you because that is not a question I would have asked myself before, but I know I'm coming out of this conversation with that question on my mind, thanks in large part to the work that you have dedicated your career to and that everybody at the Dave Thomas Foundation is working towards. So under the Lemonada mantra of making life suck less, A+ to the Dave Thomas Foundation, a lot of work ahead, but a lot of incredible work has been done. And Rita, I just want to say thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And thank you for focusing on this. You help us get the word out. And I'm so grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Good Things. This episode is presented by the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption. This series is produced by associate producer Donnie Matias. Our supervising producer is Jamila Zahra Williams. Mixing and sound design by Noah Smith. Steve Nelson is our SVP of Weekly Content. Executive producers are Stephanie Whittles-Wax and Jessica Cordova Kramer. Help others find our show by leaving us a rating and writing a review. Thanks so much for listening. See you next week. Follow Good Things wherever you get your podcasts and listen ad-free on Amazon Music with your Prime membership. Hi, everyone. Gloria Riviera here, and we are back for another season of No One Is Coming to Save Us, a podcast about America's childcare crisis. This season, we're delving deep into 5 critical issues facing our country through the lens of childcare: poverty, mental health, housing, climate change, and the public school system. By exploring these connections, we aim to highlight that childcare is not an isolated issue, but one that influences all facets of American life. Season 4 of No One Is Coming to Save Us is out now wherever you get your podcasts.
Are you looking for ways to make your everyday life happier, healthier, more productive, and more creative? I'm Gretchen Rubin, the #1 best-selling author of The Happiness Project, bringing you fresh insights and practical solutions in the Happier with Gretchen Rubin podcast. My co-host and happiness guinea pig is my sister, Elizabeth Kraft.
That's me, Elizabeth Kraft, a TV writer and producer in Hollywood. Join us as we explore ideas and hacks about cultivating happiness and good habits.
Check out Happier with Gretchen Rubin from Lemonada Media.